Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, everybody. This is Peter Joseph, March 18th, 2015. A couple of days after Z-Day weekend. I know there are a few Z-Days that are still scattered out there that will happen throughout the rest of the month. We wish them well, but the majority of them, I think, have commenced, and the feedback is slowly coming in. Germany, Berlin, that was a fantastic event. I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. But we have events, we've had events in Canada, the U.S., Mexico, South America, Latin America, Spain, France, Ireland, Germany, Ukraine, Greece, Italy, even Yemen, and the like. It's really inspiring to see the development, and I wanted to make a comment about the lecture team in general. You know, we've often talked about a global lecture team, but there really is no such thing. There's just people that come to the forefront that have experience, that are confident, and that do well, in other words, when they communicate publicly. And if you have conducted an event in your area and you've given expositions on different content, don't hesitate to send that to us. It's hard to go through all of the Z-Day lectures because there's so many of them, but always, first of all, post everything that you've done. If you can't archive it, then it sort of defeats the purpose. The internet presence is always going to be the strongest. If you had 50 people at your event, you might reach 50,000 people if you post it online. So I hope everyone out there did a good job recording this stuff. And if you have an event coming up, please record it and take photographs and start Instagrams and use the general social media to your advantage. It's really important not only for the standpoint of information, but also for the standpoint of community harnessing and keeping that sense of attachment, keeping that sense of connection between all of us. I know some small chapters out there are working with very small numbers, with very small attendance, and it really helps them to keep confidence to know that they can rise up and eventually make high attendance like many of the other small chapters, or I should say many of the other chapters that were small to begin with, because it really is a patience process. But I'm confident that any good chapter will start to bring people in. But anyway, back to the lecture team. So if you actually have lectures that you've given, please send them to media@thezeitgeistmovement.com and like anything through the normal global website. And those of us that have been around for years that have the burden of perpetually taking leads in these lectures, we will always review them, and that's how we bring in new people for the main event. It's too bad we have to say there's a main event because really everything's a main event, but obviously press and the like only want to center around one particular thing, so we harness the best quality and experience for the main event. It's not trying to be hierarchical or anything, it's just the nature of trying to be communicative. Quick note on the TZM Global application, which is currently only for iOS, but it will be for Android very soon. This new update that we recently had, if anyone received a notice for it, it has a series of issues. We're in the process of rapidly creating yet another update, so I'll just leave it at that. The problems are very obvious. If you'd seen it, there's interface registration problems and the like. But the new update is in 12 languages, if I remember correctly, or 12 to 15 languages. Obviously, that's just the interface, but it gives a great head start, and then eventually we're going to have some auto-translate stuff that happens for all the stuff that people click on in the app. So I hope that helps. And again, it will be for Android fairly soon. I know there's been big complaint on that. It's very exciting, though. If you do have that app, it's actually great because you can Skype between people, and if you pull up the Skype map, there are thousands of downloads of this thing, and there's thousands of people all over the world that are connecting each other with this particular app. It's actually a great tool. And as we all know, technology is getting smaller, more convenient. We're moving away from sort of email culture and social network culture on computers to this sort of instant communication on smaller and smaller devices. And this application gives you everything the Zeitgeist Movement does, literally in the palm of your hand. And it will get better over time. It's a long process of development, as anyone that works in the industry knows well. And that brings me to Berlin, Germany, Z-Day 2015, March 14th. The main event that happened on Saturday, it was really fantastic. It had its share of unique bumps, but all those bumps were met with great warmth. In fact, it's kind of unique when you have an event like this. You want it to be formal. You want it to be right on time. You want it to work and just be like clockwork. But sometimes things happen, and there's a lot of issues I won't go into that happened at the event. The fact that English was being spoken throughout as a second language, I think the vast majority that spoke actually weren't English speakers as a native language, So it added certain time issues as people kind of grappled with this, which is understandable and admirable, as it was quite a challenge. But it kind of made people feel like it's a part of the process, that they got to see the stumbles that we went through. But it was good and warm. We did have a 3-hour overshoot on this thing. We were supposed to end after 5 hours. We went a solid 8. But then we had a nice social event immediately after in the same space, and again, it was just like a family, like a community that was there. It was really quite phenomenal. And I have to say, it's truly unbelievable the degree of warmth and intelligence and appreciation that you see in these audiences. And if there's anything I'll say for the Zeitgeist Movement, the community in general, is it's just quite possibly the best goddamn group of people that I've ever seen. It's so diverse, all age groups, all nationalities, all races, all genders. I guess there's only 2. But it really is obscene when I think back, obscene being a good thing, and just how absolutely pleasant and thoughtful and inquisitive and supportive everyone that comes to these events are from all over the world. So kudos to all of you for your support, and I think everyone out there that has been active in this, I think you'll see this the same way, that there's a thriving investment that's happening emotionally and intellectually, and it's growing. It's growing as much as it's hard for us to see it. It's growing actually quite rapidly. And all I can say to all of you out there that have chapters, that are doing this, that are struggling along, is persevere. There's no point in being negative on anything when it comes to this. We know what we need to do, so perseverance is the only option. But back to the event. The program layout was fantastic. Ben McLeish set the stage with a great general overview and positive words and good humor, as he usually has. Frankie did a very tremendous job with overviewing the entire movement in what was really an epic and extremely well-crafted presentation. You could tell it was difficult for him, again, with the language issues, but that was absolutely beside the point. It didn't matter because it came through so well. Abby Martin came through and executed as clutch as she always does. It was probably the best execution of the whole program when it came to the energy level, as most of us are half asleep because of our travel. And, of course, Gilbert came through with some excellent points regarding chapters. James Phillips from the UK, who's been holding down the fort, who also does TZM education, gave a nice, broad sense of educational parameters and how important it is to go into schools, coupled with just a lot of general great logic regarding the simplicity of what we're talking about. We had a little cameo by Lee Camp, which was particularly hilarious and, of course, always insightful. That has been posted, I believe. I think you can find that through the Zeitgeist Movement Facebook page. Stefan Kengel, he did a really mind-blowing presentation on certain perceptual issues. It was a general perceptual treatment, which is absolutely fantastic. It wasn't necessarily completely centered to the movement, even though it had definitely a basis with it. So I think it's definitely a good watch for those that are trying to get a general sense of scientific causality, and of course how your brain can trick you to do different things. Astrid did a thing on nutrition and veganism, which was refreshing to see. There's always been a kind of a, there's a tension there with this battle between vegetarian veganism and meat-based consumption. And it's better, as I've said numerous times, to take this logic in on your own accord and realize where we are in our state of evolution. And as I've said before, when it comes to sustainable practices at this point in time, there's good ethic for the vegan position. I'm not saying that we should all adjust our values like overnight, because it's a very difficult subject. If anyone wants to know my view on that, you can go back a couple of radio shows and I addressed this at length. And of course, we all have to be very careful in our communication. As many have seen, there's a tendency to be polarizing when it comes to the way we think people should behave. So that's for everyone to think about on their own. Max did a great presentation on structural violence. That will be out as soon. And again, all these lectures will be out. They're being edited right now. And Brandon Christie came in and did a really great treatment on activism. She's from the Southern California chapter here in, of course, Los Angeles, and that was fantastic. And, of course, Eva Amore popped in and did a little closing statement, which was very inspiring. I'm not quite sure if the live webcast has been recorded and it can be uploaded. I hope it can be, meaning that it can be seen right now. I don't know. I'll have to check on that. By the way, a lot of people complain in the webcast about the advertisements. Get ad blocker. If you get ad blocker on like a Firefox platform, it will stop all of these ad protrusions in any of our webcasts. We have to pay hundreds of dollars if we were to actually have ad-free webcasts, and we just unfortunately don't have the money for that. So get an ad blocker and you will never have an interruption on these webcasts, so keep that in mind. In fact, if you don't have ad blocker, you should get it anyway, because you can block all YouTube ads and everything else. I don't know what I would do, frankly, without my ad blocker. And now I'm going to continue with the questions, which hopefully I can finally get to the rest of them. These are the original questions that were posted in two forum solicitations. So let's see where I am here. Question 1. As people are knowing about a resource-based economy, there are already certain geographical locations where people practice a natural-based system, like parts in the Amazon, some islands, where no monetary system, private property, and no government exists. How would people who don't rely on outside elements be involved in a global resource-based economy? Well, that's a very interesting question. The first thing I'm curious about is how you point out that they already practice a natural-based system, and then the question is, how would people who don't rely on outside elements be involved? It's kind of a unique parallel, in fact. If you lived, say, in the Amazon, you had a small tribe, and by the way, there are very few indigenous cultures out there that actually have the privilege of living separate from westernized society. I say westernized because really the whole world has become westernized. And if you can name an indigenous culture that's truly separated right now, I'd love to hear it. I did some investigation on this years ago, and there was the Piaha, and there's a couple of other ones that are kind of smattered around. They're sort of there, but not really. There's very few cultures out there that haven't been polluted, so to speak. So in regards to your question regarding people that aren't reliant, and do they have a need, essentially, for a global resource-based system, as you put it, the answer is, I guess, not. I mean, this isn't the type of system where it forcefully makes everybody in the world comply with the interests of some kind of management organization. Because it's based on natural law, it has more in common with the indigenous cultures, the first world nations of the world. That's actually something that's long lost in the rhetoric we tend to talk about. This is much more about a kind of subsistence logic, a natural, tribal, homeostasis-based logic than it is about some crazy advanced technological world. The technological elements are extensions of this process, as opposed to what we have today, of course, which is bent on growth and expansion and just these irrational value disorders that want more and more and more. And that's not what the First Nations people and many other indigenous cultures are about. Clearly, if you've studied any of that. In fact, I have a book that I recommend. It's called Learning Native Wisdom by Gary Halfus. In fact, I used a quote by Gary Halfus in my lecture at Z-Day in Berlin. He does a good job of analyzing the system and then describing from experience, because he lived in Alaska, how the natives there operated and the differences between culture today and in this very simplified world. And there's an enormous amount to learn from this earlier ideology, so to speak. I think the term is denatured, and we've become denatured. Gabor Mate did a great job talking about this regarding childbearing. Parents learn certain things, they have certain cultural practices, certain bad psychology has emerged over time, and it's very much contingent upon selfish culture, I think, and that's for another conversation. Gabor Mate talks about how in indigenous cultures in Africa, for example, the child, once born, is kept really close to the mother, touching at all times, which, as we learned today, finally, in modern public health science, is extremely important, extremely critical, that connection, that human bonding. I spoke about this issue, actually, a little bit in my Berlin lecture, how there is indeed a human nature that relates to our development, because we really are social organisms. And there's a lot of bad science out there historically. I remember even talking about this with some family members who grew up, and they believed, the grandparents believed, that you wouldn't touch kids when they were crying. You just didn't, you were supposed to teach them something as infants, that they're supposed to be self-reliant, and if they cried, you just leave them alone. There was some kind of German science that went towards this as well back in the mid-20th century. And of course, that's an atrocious thing to do. Kids need support as infants and as young children. They need security, in other words, and if you deny them that, then they have a high propensity to be insecure in in adult life. And this is stuff that Gabor Mate talks about a great deal. Emotional loss, I think, is the term that he uses. Anyway, my actual point has to do with this denaturing applying to larger order society, larger order awareness, and where you don't even understand anything about where your food comes from or how you relate to the environment. I guess, for using old language, your spiritual relationship is distorted. So anyway, going back to your question, there's no reason that people that live on the outskirts of modern society today would need to just completely conform to any new model that's there. And the more natural law-oriented, or as you say, natural-based they are, the higher the odds that they're going to appreciate the system as it is. Question number 2. Watching interviews, I get the impression that the assertion is that we do not need democracy and that decisions will be arrived at. This is hard to imagine. There always needs to be someone to make a decision. I don't think a supercomputer is going to amass all the information and say make a decision about saving the sperm whale over the panda without people feeling let down. All right, I'm trying to think of how to hold myself back on this myth that tends to occur, where it's assumed that a supercomputer, which no one has to interact with, makes all the decisions that we do. And ultimately, it has nothing to do with that. And I wish I could find the best way to explain this. It's not about some supercomputer with some all-seeing vision that makes all the decisions, such as saving the sperm whale or saving the panda. It's really only about economics, first of all. Any type of calculation that's required in the context of what we're describing is about economic unfolding. Other decisions throughout society can retain a basic democratic process. And I say that using traditional notions of democracy, which in a community has its value. But when it comes to really specific elements, specifically economy, where there is an unfolding logic, where there is a complete and utter and almost empirical assessment in calculation of what needs to be done and why it needs to be done, because it's the most logical state for efficiency, abundance, and sustainability, you don't need this type of democratic process as we see it today, or I should say political process. There is no democratic requirement to build a really great bridge. There's no democratic requirement to make sure that economic unfolding is sustainable. I'll put it this way: subjective interests of the species will eventually be defined by objective processes. Once you get into objective processes, you no longer need the democratic attribute. It's about doing it right. But the goals, of course, have to be set by culture. There's no question about that. And as far as the specifics of that, just read the final section of the last few chapters of the Zeitgeist Movement Defined, or see my lecture, Economic Calculation and Natural Law Resource-Based Economy. The way democracy works, the way participation works in the design process of cities, the design process of goods, this is all based on human interaction and a type of consensus making that's done technically through contribution and open source platform. The technical description of it is the collaborative design system, which again is detailed at length in that lecture and in the book. So please review that. Question 3. I was wondering if you're familiar with anarchism, and I'm not referring to anarchy or anarcho-capitalism, but this, anarchism, and he gives a link. The reason I'm mentioning anarchism is because it seems to have a lot in common with a resource-based economy train of thought, especially based on Murray Bookchin's post-scarcity anarchism work. Do you think it would be worthwhile to cooperate with the anarchist community and learn from each other? If you're not familiar, then that's fine, but would you be willing to learn about it and tell us what you think? Yes, I'm familiar with post-scarcity anarchism by Murray Bookchin. I haven't actually read all of it, but I do have it. And I find it fascinating, and it just goes to show how many angles there are that approach the same subject. I would definitely be open to any conversation on this nature. It's a little bit superfluous to me. I mean, I find that there's so many angles, but if you use the train of thought and you just get to the bottom of it yourself with your own critical reasoning, all the variations just sort of dispel themselves. And when I think about public health, when you think about the basis of efficient industrial design, when you think about what system organization means in fundamental systems theory. In all the variations I've read, I find no grand deviation from any of these ideas. In fact, I find them to be deficient. And a lot of these philosophies tend to harp on more archaic abstractions that don't have a direct link to the life ground or any kind of referential logic to completely tangible scientific and physical processes, which, as we all know, must underlie all general philosophy. So anyway, to answer your question, yeah, I'd be happy to speak with anyone of this nature that deals with this type of general worldview. Anyone's welcome. I would love to talk to people that are on the edge, that deal with post-scarcity in general. Again, there are so many just old, archaic, and diverse ideologies, and as much as I'm hated probably for saying this, there really is a small sphere of relevant ideologies that seem to relate to natural law. And the more we live, the more we understand, the more narrow this particular logic becomes. So, back to Bookchin, there the idea of libertarian municipalism, if I remember correctly. This is the idea of detached communities that have their own democracy in small communities, and they essentially override the existence of a larger order state. There's a certain, that's a generalization, but there's a certain truth to that with respect to the Zeitgeist Movement's, the Zeitgeist Movement's advocation of a natural law resource-based economy, this Gandhian vision of overlapping concentric societies as opposed to hierarchical structures. So the logic is actually quite easy, especially when you get into post-scarcity and the localization of resources and the utilization of all the things that the society needs, that community needs, in its local area. And what's really required at that point is a larger order system connection, the network, just like you metaphorically see with the Internet. The Internet is both a massive global network, and it's also a series of very, very small networks, and it depends on your level of participation. You could be involved in a general web participation that is completely local, that isn't global, and you're completely navigating this in a localized way. This is a loose metaphor, but I hope you get my point. But then again, simultaneously, everything's connected to a larger network. Doesn't mean you're utilizing the larger network, but it's there. Question 4, what are the greatest examples of the deliberate suppression of technological efficiency? Well, you can go into old textbooks regarding design, industrial design, and you'll find the idea of planned obsolescence. The Phoebus light bulb cartel, which was in a documentary called The Light Bulb Conspiracy, I believe it's under a different name now, they revised it, does a great job of going through the history of this. And rest assured that in the bowels of pretty much every major corporate headquarters, as far as their design team, they are justifying they're justifying planned obsolescence and technological inefficiency in some way. In the book, The Zeitgeist Movement Defined, it talks about both planned obsolescence and intrinsic obsolescence. Both of them are probably equally as insidious. I won't go into the definitions of each. If you haven't read the book, please do so. The Zeitgeist Movement Defined, it's free, thezeitgeistmovement.com. It's also in paperback form. But there's no industry that doesn't engage in planned obsolescence. Intrinsic obsolescence is the input. It's the rationale, if you will. People say, well, we're going to be cheap on this particular component because we're going to save money. We have to. And they know, though, that they could spend a little bit more money to have a better item that would make the good long-lasting. But they don't because it's cheaper. We talk about planned obsolescence and intrinsic obsolescence as being separate, but in fact they very much merge together. So they willfully are withholding efficiency for the sake of being competitive in the market. And then at the highest extreme of this, you have Apple, you have a lot of other companies that, again, deep in the bowels, and I wish this information would come out. I've asked a lot of engineers about this because it's ground for massive global lawsuit. And I guarantee you eventually it's going to leak at some point that the major computer manufacturers are deliberately creating systems that will die in roughly 3 to 4 years, as with every single Macintosh I've ever owned, or at least they'll become so tedious and cumbersome that to deal with them is so inconvenient that you want to update and get a new set of hardware, etc. Question 4, are you familiar with biomimicry? If so, how do you see its role in the design process at the Global Redesign Institute? I've talked about biomimicry quite a bit. Biomimicry is a very specific type of design science. If you read books on it, it's very, very specific. in kind of a micro context. You don't really see biomimicry applied in very large-scale contexts, at least, again, as per general design science as it exists now. As far as the Global Redesign Institute, that is a macroeconomic project, and naturally, biomimicry really is the embracing of natural order things and natural order designs, and of course, the Global Redesign Institute will embrace that very type of efficiency. So it's similar, but not quite the same. So if you look up biomimicry again, and then look up what's been defined as the Global Redesign Institute, you'll see that there's, again, similarity, but it's not quite the same. It's more of a train of thought that generates the Global Redesign Institute as opposed to actual emulation of nature in a rather visceral sense, which is common to biomimicry. Question 5, how do you see humanity's new capability and focus if the tenets of the Zeitgeist Movement were fully realized? Humanity's new capability and focus. Well, it would be needless to say absolutely profound. For example, right now we have a competitive system that has patents for everything that's invented. Open source in software has proven that it's revolutionary, that it's incredible, that people want to contribute, they don't even be paid for it. You can have an open source software platform that will move much more quickly in development, will be updated faster because people care, because they're using it. Now imagine if you applied that to actual industrial design, which is the idea by the way of the Localized Solutions Project, which will be paired in with the Global Redesign Institute. But comedically enough, I have a certain internal dissonance with that project, because who's going to use it? I put it out there as a form of poetry, because what you're asking people to do is to present open source designs for engineering through CAD and the like, and for other people to contribute to it. But to do that, you're foregoing any type of ownership and patent that could possibly make you money in the future. But yet at the same time, this is what will elevate society and make it that much more efficient and productive when it comes to material invention. There's no question that open source industrial design will be just like open source software design, and it will exponentially increase productivity and expression when it comes to what can be done in innovation. Anyway, I have to stop there. I hope that makes sense. But what can be realized is just unfathomable when you get people out of the treadmill of labor and get them to actually think about efficiency and productivity and public health directly and get rid of this proxy system. And about 30 seconds left. I really appreciate everybody listening. And if you haven't sent in your Z-Day stuff, or if you haven't posted it, and then ideally send it in to us at media@thezeitgeistmovement.com or the link through zdayglobal.org. Please do so. We want to archive all of this, of course. And thank you all, and I'll talk to you all very soon. Ciao.